Great. Wonderful. Okay, bienvenue. Thank you everyone for coming to the 29th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. Season 2 will build on the themes of the earlier series, but will also ask questions about sustainability, maintenance, right to repair, and the power of speculative futures. And this is our last event of 2020. Past series speakers, Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean, have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it is important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. The series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. We are currently located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by the Mi'kmaq fishermen and communities and the Wet'suwet'en people at the Unistoten camp make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations that we have today. The series was made possible thanks to our many funders. A special thanks to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the IGSF, Milieu, the Indigenous Futures Lab, the Intersectionality Research Hub, MILA, the Black Feminist Futures Working Group, Cinema Politica, and more. Please check out our website and social media for a list of upcoming talks. I'm pleased to announce some of our 2021 speakers. Next year, so starting in the winter of 2021, we'll have Deb Raji speaking about facial recognition technology, Yeshi Milner speaking about abolishing big data and data for Black lives, Sasha Costanza-Chalk speaking about design justice, Chancey Fleet on disability and accessibility in tech, Dr. Eleanor Carmi on media distortions, which is a rescheduled event, Carolyn Sanders on feminist data set, and Carabot Anna Brandusko on the climate of AI finance, and artist Stephanie Dinkins. We already have videos of past events, and we will have information about these future events shared on our website and social media, disruptingdisruptions.com. All of our events are free to attend, open to the public, and while virtual, professionally captioned. Thank you today to our captionist. For this event, recording is enabled, so the event can be posted on YouTube later and embedded on our website. Don't worry, only the speakers will be shown in the video. We also have a Q&A option available. So throughout the talk, you can type your questions into the Q&A answer box, and there will be time at the end for Joy to answer them. Okay, so now for today's event. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Joy Lisi Rankin. She is the author of A People's History of Computing in the United States. It's a great book, and we're celebrating its 2nd anniversary today. She earned her PhD from Yale University in 2015. It was an exchange scholar at MIT during 2012 to 2014, and a visiting scholar postdoctoral fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences during 2015 to 2016. In 2018, she fired Michigan State University in protest, choosing to leave her tenure-track position after publication of her book. She is currently a research scholar at the New York University, NYU, where she leads the research program in gender, race, and power in artificial intelligence at the AI Now Institute. So thank you, Joy, for being here, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for that introduction. And also thank you all of you who are here joining and listening tonight. Alex, you mentioned in the introduction that everything we do now is connected to the land that we're on, and the history of what we're doing now cannot be disconnected from that. And it is a theme that will be in my talk as well, something we hadn't planned, but is serendipitous. So I just wanted to highlight that. So to just jump right in, my research has been animated by attention to people who historically have been considered irrelevant to innovation, but who have nonetheless been agents of technological and social change. One of the questions guiding my research has been, what does it mean to write history from the user up? And my book, A People's History of Computing in the United States, answers that question. When I was researching A People's History of Computing, stories of students and teachers, principals and professors, touchscreens and video games in places like New Hampshire and Minnesota and Illinois jumped off the pages of the newsletters and grant reports and other documents that I was looking at in archives across the United States. Those are not the people or places that typically come to mind for the history of computing during the 1960s and 1970s. The title of my book nods to Howard Zinn's groundbreaking A People's History of the United States. Published 40 years ago, Zinn's book channeled the energies of the social and political movements of the long 1960s and the ensuing outpouring of social history to write a new kind of American history. Zinn did not write about founding fathers and presidents, captains of industry, war heroes, and other influential white men. Instead, he featured people rarely seen or heard in synthetic or textbook history to that point, including Native Americans, young women factory workers, enslaved African Americans, socialists, and pacifists. I would say today, the history of contemporary tech culture has likewise been dominated by a great white men, or maybe a handful of women, storyline. In my book, I outline what I call the Silicon Valley mythology. And this is the idea that the information age had founding fathers, people like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg. So according to this origin story, this Silicon Valley mythology, there were no computers for ordinary people, no personal computing, no social media or social networking until those founding fathers and their hardware and software made computing accessible to everyone. That narrative, by focusing on the few, has obliterated the history of the many people across the United States and around the world who have been computing in different ways for decades. My book is A People's History of Computing because it tells the story of hundreds of thousands of computing citizens. Like Zinn's history from the bottom up, this is a history from the user up. The people in A People's History of Computing are the students and educators who built and used academic computing networks, which at the time were known as time-sharing systems, during the 1960s and 1970s. And I want to say right off the bat that time-sharing is often misunderstood as a name. It doesn't refer to the idea that the students were like signing up for time in increments and sharing that way, like I get 15 minutes and then you get 15 minutes, but rather it referred to the idea that the computer was sharing its own time. A mainframe computer was programmed to interrupt its own time to be able to check for multiple incoming communication requests and programs, and as a result could be used by multiple people simultaneously. So time sharing was a form of networked computing in which multiple computing terminals were connected to a central computer by phone lines. So multiple users could work on their individual terminals, which I identify as personal terminals, simultaneously. And because the terminals were connected to this central computer or mainframe computer by phone line, they could be located in different cities or different states or even different countries from the mainframe computer. So this is just one example of a network where there was a mainframe in New Hampshire and there were terminals in Maine, Minnesota, Connecticut. In this particular network, which I talk about in my book, the terminals extended into Canada as well. So in many cases, the terminals were teletypewriters or teletypes, which looked like this. So something like a typewriter, for those of us who can remember what a typewriter looked like, but with a printer roll attached. And in this picture, there's no paper in the printer roll, but with paper in it, it's where a user would be able to type and see what they were programming or communicating to the computer, and they would type run, for instance, and send that off to the computer, and then the computer would communicate back to the user by printing out lines on the same teletype. So users would type their messages or programs on this keyboard and receive printed responses on the teletype within seconds. At the University of Illinois, however, the PLATO network featured flat panel plasma screen displays with touch screens before 1975. So keep in mind, I am talking about the 1960s and 1970s. And in all of these cases, terminals, whether they were teletypes or PLATO terminals, were in such social settings as middle school classrooms, college dorm rooms, and university computing labs. Because the terminals relayed information to and from the central computer by phone line, they could be and were, like I said, hundreds of miles away from the processing computer. So, A People's History of Computing in the US focuses on the users of these time-sharing networks to develop a history of the digital age that emphasizes creativity, collaboration, and community. Time-sharing networks emerged neither from individual genius nor from the military-industrial complex. Rather, they were created by and for students and educators as civilian and civic-minded projects. I developed the concept of computing citizens to describe those who access time-sharing networks. In A People's History of Computing, the definition of a computing citizen hinges on membership in a computing community. This is a broad and inclusive definition of citizenship, mirroring the ways in which the advocates of these networks envisioned and hoped for computing access as broad and inclusive. Here too, citizenship emphasizes the communal institutions, such as schools, universities, state governments, and the US National Science Foundation that enabled access and participation. So the book's characterization of computing citizens is not explicitly intended in the political sense of citizenship, but questions of political membership can nevertheless be explored through the makeup of each network. So tonight, I'm just going to use one case study to highlight the creation of computing citizens. And I am tonight focusing on the PLATO network, which is based at the University of Illinois. I should mention in my book, I also talk about networks that were across New England and, like I said, reaching into Canada and across the Northeast, as well as networks centered in Minnesota and reaching outward from there, and several other networks, time-sharing networks during the 60s and the 70s. In the case of PLATO, which is what I'll speak about tonight, it was developed at the University of Illinois during the early 1960s. By 1975, there were nearly 1,000 PLATO plasma screen terminals on the nationwide PLATO network that enabled online communication in the form of bulletin boards, instant messages, screen sharing, and electronic mail. Although the network had started as an experiment in education, its citizens devised explicitly political uses, such as producing a program about an environmental issue. Finally, analyzing PLATO citizens vividly illustrates a long history of gendered online harassment, attempts to silence and restrict women's voices, thereby circumscribing their computing citizenship. So PLATO was the acronym for Programmed Logic for Automatic Teaching Operations. And as I mentioned, the system originated in 1960 at the University of Illinois to explore how computers could be used for education. This is the Automatic Teaching Operations, ATO, part of PLATO. The people who used PLATO during the 1960s and 70s accessed computing on this network as members of a community. Students, educators, and Urbana-Champaign and beyond community members sat in front of personal terminals, and they computed and communicated with each other as a public good, subsidized by the federal and state government. They watched movies on their CRT displays, or cathode ray tube displays, which was the television technology of the 1960s. And they manipulated chemical bonds with the touch screens on their plasma displays. They were not consumers. They were users, yes, and in many cases they were authors, which is how the PLATO community referred to creators of new PLATO programs. So what we might call programmers or coders. I call them computing citizens. During the spring of 1970, Valerie Lamont, one of those computing citizens, she's pictured here all the way to the right, giving a demonstration on PLATO, she wrote a computer program. Lamont was studying political science as a graduate student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her program, called Boneyard Creek, presented the history of a stream that ran through the campus and the communities of Champaign and Urbana. In this program, users learned about the stream's flooding and pollution, and they learned about solutions for those problems. They viewed photographs of the creek on individual screens, and they provided comments to Lamont with personal keyboards below their screens. As a graduate student in political science, Valerie creatively deployed PLATO to stimulate what she called, quote, citizen participation in community planning. She situated her work here firmly within the social movements of the long 1960s. She was trying to encourage democracy and democratic participation through involvement with PLATO. Although she presented her Boneyard Creek program as an unbiased experiment in community planning, in informing the community about the creek, she clearly constructed the program to persuade users against something called sheet piling, which was a method of flood control. So there were 105 slides in Valerie's program, and they offered a simple but compelling narrative of decline, of environmental decline. So going through this program and through the slides, and slides like we would imagine Google Slides or PowerPoint slides today, where users could see photographs and graphics, text alongside images on their computer screens in 1970. Going through this program, the story was, once upon a time, the creek was pristine, but development, pollution, and sheet piling, the work of humans, harmed the creek and its wildlife. So Lamont shared her program with the Urbana-Champaign public during the spring of 1970, in the months following that first Earth Day of 1970. She described each gathering of individuals who used the program as a, quote, demonstration. And here I want to call attention to the fact of the dual meanings of the word demonstration. Sure, it was a computer demo, just like we're sort of accustomed to hearing today if someone's demoing new technology. But she also referenced the fact that her word choice of demonstration invoked Senator Gaylord Nelson's call for a nationwide teach-in or demonstration to raise awareness for local and national environmental concerns as part of the Earth Day environmental teach-ins. So at the end of her Boneyard Creek program in Plato, Valerie urged users to additional action. The Boneyard Creek program suggested writing letters to government officials, calling for rezoning, calling for cleanup projects, landscaping projects, and of course, inviting other friends and colleagues to use this Plato Boneyard Creek program. Valerie's program, I argue, represented a personal and social computing approach to an extension of the April 1970 Earth Day activism. For Lamont and her users, the personal terminals of the PLATO network offered a new form of political participation. Lamont explicitly connected computing citizenship with political citizenship, and having a social network voice with having a political voice. Within a few years of Lamont's Boneyard Creek demonstrations, thousands of Plato citizens swapped jokes and stories every day on their online network, and they reveled in this new sociability. At the same time, they struggled with security, censorship, harassment, and their interactions revealed a gendered digital divide. So the Plato online community was documented in part through the preservation of 4 years of system notes files, which were basically Plato message boards. And what I have here on screen is just a snapshot of how the notes would have looked. It's basically, you would see this orange text on the black screen. And in the 1970s, because memory was a challenge on the network, some of the public notes files were wiped out about every 2 weeks. They were sort of deleted and cleared for storage space. But before that happened, the system administrators printed out these notes files, which, like I said, were public bulletin boards where users could exchange and interact, exchange notes and messages and interact about different topics. And somehow those printouts made it to the archives at the University of Illinois. They were preserved, they're digitized, they are accessible publicly online, and they're about, like I said, 4 years of these notes files. So reading through 4 years of notes files, you get a pretty good idea of how a community is functioning and communicating. And I am tremendously, I have to say, grateful to the archivists at the University of Illinois for not just preserving these, but digitizing them, and to the Plato people back in the 70s who imagined that somebody might want to read these printouts. Somebody like me might want to read these printouts someday, and maybe some of you want to read these printouts. So going back to the 1970s, there were many people at the time who celebrated the Plato network, which truly was amazing in some ways, but they celebrated the communication as, quote, truly egalitarian because it was, and here I'm quoting, quote, stripped of its stereotypic cues like sex, age, race, tone of voice, physical characteristic, smells, and body language, end quote. So I want to pause here and say, notably, it was always adult white men who were celebrating what they saw as this equitable and unbiased version of Plato. Because, of course, on Plato, identities were not truly obscured. The women who regularly posted to these notes received and complained about harassment, inappropriate comments, and patronizing attitudes. And I have just a few examples of this that I've pulled from the 4 years of notes. So in November 1974, Ruth bemoaned, "Arg, I am getting very tired of having people call me on talk and ask me what I am doing, if I am female, if my name is really Ruth, if I know any short games, and other nonsense ad infinitum." The responses to Ruth's comment demonstrated the pervasive sexism of the PLATO network. So first, Al suggested that Ruth remove her name from the users list, even though Ruth had clearly explained in her original post that she wanted to remain in the users list so that her collaborators could easily reach her. Next, Bruce suggested that Ruth just get a sense of humor about it. And then he added the condescending comment, "If you're really bothered by others who are just being friendly over an impersonal machine, I truly feel sorry for you." Next, Dawn echoed Bruce's comment, also patronizing Ruth, saying, "I really feel sorry for people who can't say get lost when they are up to their ears in work." So, as just a few examples, we see Al, Dawn, and Bruce, as men, had experienced neither the frequency of crank calling that Ruth received, nor the unwanted and inappropriate sexual attention. And this is just one example of many. There are several instances of women saying, "People won't leave me alone," or "Please stop talking to me this way." And typically then multiple men say, "Why can't you just get along with everyone else?" So instead of offering sympathy to Ruth and the other women, or helpful approaches to her problem, or recognizing their own roles in contributing to this environment and how they could act in changing that environment, these men criticized Ruth and the other women's complaint. They blamed the victims. So the discrimination against women on the PLATO network mirrored the women's experiences using PLATO on campus. When women had priority on the system as students or as authors, and they asked PLATO gamers, who were often young men, to vacate a PLATO terminal, the women were harassed or mocked. And that harassment on at least 2 occasions turned physical, or reportedly turned physical. So between Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1974, 2 women were attacked in the women's restroom closest to the central PLATO lab on campus. Afterwards, one user posted to the notes file, "What's this world coming to? A decent sociopath like myself can't even have a little fun flirting with a chick or two in the restroom without someone getting all excited about it. I guess I can go back to elevators and stairwells." This response, which minimizes the actual problem of violence against women, epitomized the casual misogyny of the PLATO network and its home, its physical home, in Urbana-Champaign. So in my book, I describe the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s as a, quote, golden age of network computing. I argue that 1960s and 1970s American students and educators collaboratively created personal computing and social networking on the academic computing networks they built and used. But scholarship and thinking change over time, and as a historian, I want to make that practice transparent. Since I began writing the book, I incorporated more scholarship on gender, race, and power into my research and teaching. As a longtime contributing editor for the magazine and podcast Lady Science, I wrote numerous essays that articulated the relationships among race, gender, labor, technology, and social constructions of intelligence. That work has continued as I've written for other publications, including Slate and Logic. I rectified my own epistemic injustice. I now have the terms to name and describe the harassment and salary discrimination that I experienced as a tech startup employee in my 20s. I have become more vocal about the long history of racism, sexism, and harassment on social media. I became the target of an extended online and offline harassment campaign precisely for publicly sharing some of this research that I'm sharing with you tonight. And I'm happy to talk about any of this, or I shouldn't say happy. I will talk about any of this during Q&A. So this combination of scholarship and lived experience honed the argument in my book and the conclusion I'm making today. Although those 1960s and 1970s networks were developed with a vision of computing for the public good, structural racism and sexism constructed them as white, macho computing cultures. In other words, the years 1965 to 1975 were a golden age of networked computing for affluent, young, white men. This thread runs throughout the history of technology and public life. Technology often amplifies the existing structural inequalities that hamper democracy. So I think of my work as unfinished business. Writing feminist, anti-racist, queer, and just histories of technology is certainly unfinished. I ask, whose voices will we lift up? Whose will we repeat and endorse and remember? And I say, in answer to that, history needs multiple voices, perspectives, and interpretations. Indeed, we need histories not of computers, but of the acts of computing. We need multiple, complex, nuanced histories of the now quotidian technologies that we use and that are used on us all of the time. I lead now the Gender, Race, and Power program at the AI Now Institute, where we mobilize history to make visible and actionable the inequitable power structures on which AI technologies are built. AI systems draw on our past and our present to create models of the world that are shaping lives and opportunities. These models encode all of the assumptions, inequities, and oppressions of our social and political systems then, in the 1960s and 1970s, and now in the 2020s. This means that the AI field in particular must address and account for history. This history, a people's history of computing, it's still with us. From the fact that 30% of all American K-12 public school students live in homes without an internet connection or adequate device to distance learning, to the fact that a quarter of women polled in 8 different countries have experienced online abuse or harassment. And precisely because this history moves through the present, responsible technology must be as much backward looking and past reckoning as it is forward thinking and future planning. Thank you.
Joy, thank you so much for your talk. Yeah, okay, I'm going to show you showing up. So just wanted to check. So thank you for the people who have already posted questions in the Q&A box. I want to encourage other people here to also ask questions into the Q&A box, and we will only say the first name of question askers in case people are worried about privacy. So I'm going to begin by reading Janisa's question. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So Janisa asks, how did collaborative and community computing occur in countries other than the US?
Oh. I have not done, I should say, I am an American historian and I have not done research about this myself, but I can certainly point, for instance, to the example of France, which developed its Minitel network as a time-sharing network in a similar time frame of the 1960s through, and Minitel was, there's a great book about this co-authored by Kevin Driscoll, and I forget the name of his co-author right now, but about Minitel as a network. The UK, Great Britain also had numerous time-sharing networks, and the BBC, in fact, I believe developed a computer meant to be used on time-sharing networks during the 1970s and early 1980s. There's a book about this as well. And what I do know from my research on these collaborative and community networks is, for instance, time-sharing was spread to other countries besides Canada, I should say, obviously, and the UK and France, because really anyone who could have access to a phone line, a teletype terminal, and a mainframe computer could be connected to one of these networks. And in the 1960s, companies like General Electric often provided time sharing as a business service or an option for communities or school systems to connect to. So this is one of the areas where I say more research needs to be done, because when I started my research on this book, I didn't expect to find nearly as many communities as I did, and I only focused on some of the largest ones that I could find. But even across the United States, there were multiple other time-sharing networks. So I would love to see, here's a call for all the scholars out there, please write the stories of these communities in the 60s and 70s and 80s, because I am sure they're out there. Yeah.
Fantastic. That kind of dovetails into a question from Jack, who wanted to thank you for the presentation and your work in general. And Jack writes, I'm at the University of Illinois and remember my excitement at first experiencing PLATO. I'm curious if you've done research on PrairieNet, the community free net developed a bit later at the U of I.
I have not done research on PrairieNet. So this is new. I mean, I have heard of it, but I have not done research about it. And I should note too, actually, PLATO had an incredible lifespan. It was established in the 1960s, but ran well into the 1990s on the University of Illinois, not just sort of on the University of Illinois network, but at one point Control Data Corporation, which was a major computing corporation, purchased the rights to PLATO and sold PLATO networks to other college systems. The University of Maryland had a PLATO system, University of, I want to say the Florida University system, South Africa. So PLATO's life and sort of iterations is another area where more work could be done. And I would love to hear more about PrairieNet as well. Yeah.
I might add a question before I ask Ushni, because mine kind of dovetails into that as well, which is, would you please speak a little bit about the new directions of your research and maybe some of like the networks you're looking at or technologies themselves and how you're exploring race and gender with computing and computing systems more, just so we can have a sense of how the project has developed in more detail over the last 2 years.
Yes. So when I started writing my book, which was back in 2012, which now seems like a very long time ago, my main focus was on gender and technology. And then over the course of writing it, I was reading more intensively and immersed myself in critical race theory, critical sort of more broadly Black history in the United States as well. And some of the work I'm doing now is really to think about the intersections of the history of education and technology more broadly, as the fact that even how these computing networks in the 1960s and 70s developed and were deployed became essentially technologies of whiteness because of who, and certainly in the United States, who had access to them, often in affluent school systems, et cetera, and how that can't be disconnected from longer histories of racialized capitalism in the United States. And so now I'm working more to sort of draw out these connections among race and capitalism and education, in some cases focusing on the same networks. And in a parallel project that is absolutely not disconnected, but is different, thinking about in the United States, but certainly Silicon Valley right now talks a lot about the pipeline problem or the pathways problem, and who is in tech. And there's a lot of rhetoric around we need to increase diversity in tech. And literally people have been talking about this problem in the same way for almost 50 years. And so really analyzing that history, putting it in context, what do we mean when we talk about the pipeline problem? What does that ask us to include or exclude? And how do these computing networks and sort of the trajectory of the development of Silicon Valley and sort of its mythology, but also how it is actualized in terms of sort of public school access to computing. What does this mean? So that's where my research is going now. And certainly at AI Now, we are, as a team, focused on the social implications of algorithmic technologies and artificial intelligence. And what I can bring to that as a historian is saying AI, because it is deeply rooted in these histories of classification and hierarchy that are not years old or decades old, but centuries old, we really have to attend to how not just those algorithms and classifications have been constructed, but also to the fact that data itself is made. It is constructed, it is not collected, it is not neutral. And so really highlighting the histories of those areas and how they intersect with feminism and feminist work and anti-racist work and accessible work.
Fantastic. So Jack has included some basic info in PrairieNet that I'll send to you after the talk. So thanks, Jack.
Great. Thank you.
And a question from Ushnish. Ushnish asks, do you think structural sexism and related violence has become more coded into the software applications themselves, such as female voice assistants, automated chatbots, etc.? Like, has the problem actually intensified over time?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, I'm laughing because that's, for me, that is a resounding yes. All of the research is showing that structural sexism, harassment in technology is more pervasive. It's more of it. it's an increasing issue. It's one that wasn't recognized for a long time because for many years, people, policymakers, regulators, law, treated the internet as like, quote, not real life or somehow separate, and didn't recognize the harms that could be perpetuated and how the violence against women, people of color, others who have been historically excluded or marginalized, how real that was and how it could cross over. And so absolutely now, I think without a second thought, the ways that we're seeing the feminization of an Alexa or a Siri, and other colleagues of mine have written about this as well. But it is, you know, to mention, for instance, Sophia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression, about how Google searches are perpetuating systemic racism, especially against women of color. So yes, the problem is worse, and I don't have a quick fix for it, but to call for social movements and recognizing that the fixes are not going to come from only from above.
Wonderful. I want again encourage the attendees who are still with us, if you want to ask questions, to type it into the Q&A. And while we wait for other questions, but also no pressure to ask questions, while we wait for questions, I'm wondering if as your project has continued to develop, and you're saying you're looking at very similar networks, as you're looking at new computing citizens or different computing systems, has the geography shifted a bit in your analysis? Are you looking in different regions than, for example, like New Hampshire as much or in Illinois as much, or is it still located in similar places?
I think sort of as we move closer to the present, like the geography becomes more dispersed in some ways, because moving into the 80s becomes more about personal computers coming into homes, but again, sort of questions of like not just homes and school systems. And here now I'm relying on more research needs to be done. People write more about the 80s and the 90s because I can't do it by myself. But those, my colleagues who have written about it, to show again that often computers were moving into wealthy school systems and white school systems, sort of across the United States. In terms of networking, there are great examples of online archives from the Well, which was West Coast focused, but there's also Echo, which is the East Coast Hangout, which is New York focused. And I had an amazing serendipitous connection with Stacy Horn, who is one of the founders of Echo in New York. And we had a conversation, and I was talking about networks in Minnesota. And Minnesota was, I say often, the Silicon Valley of the United States in the 1950s through 1980s, in the sense that this is forgotten now, but at the time, no other region in the United States or even the world could match the sort of Minneapolis-St. Paul region for the concentration and economic power of its computing industry. And what it meant is that there was also a lot of support for computing as a public good in Minnesota during the 60s. So Minnesota had a statewide public computing network by 1975. And I was explaining this during a talk, and Stacy was there, and she said, oh my gosh, there were so many Minnesota area people on Echo in the early 80s and mid 80s, and I never knew why. And we were like, oh, so I mean, and it's this idea too that there's just this long unrecognized tale of, if you have access to computing in the 60s and 70s, and it is within these networks that within the 60s and 70s rapidly become masculine and white, that doesn't go away. It just, there are people who continue to be on those networks and carry forward into later networks or different networks, where they're bringing those habits of communication and patterns of behavior into the future.
Thank you so much for that. Ushnish has another question, which is, has the representation of women and people of color in academic, government, civil sector technology projects greater than private? I think the question might be like, is the representation of women and people of color in academic, government, civil sector technology projects greater than private sector projects?
This is a tricky question because of how data is constructed. So what I can say we know, certainly in the United States, is that, and I want to be very sort of specific about what I'm referring to. So in terms of people earning computer science degrees, in the United States in the mid 1980s, it was at an all-time high of over 40%, or around 40% women. Not data, and I was just looking at a report, data was not disaggregated or collected by if those women were Black or Asian or Latina, etc. So by the early 2000s, that number had dropped to something like 10% or lower. And it hasn't really risen. And I mention this because this is sort of what people are talking about with the pipeline problem, is this idea that, oh, we need to do more work to keep women and Indigenous people, people of color, etc., to get them, quote, into tech and keep them in tech. But it often, certainly in the US, doesn't recognize that there are, for instance, many people working on something like an H-1B visa who are people of color who are not recognized as working in the tech industry, or similarly, there historically were people who were working as key punch operators or data operators, quote, working in the tech industry, but are not recognized as such. So I don't mean this to be a sort of circuitous answer in any way, but rather to be direct about the fact that, like, this is a political question about who is counted as a tech worker, what we count as tech work, what we count as computer, quote, science. There are questions of credentialing here, citizenship status, work status, etc. So how we count and who we count is not neutral. It is political, and those numbers in some ways can be made to tell different stories depending on the kind of story you want to tell.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer and for all of your answers. I mean, I could ask you questions all night and nerd out about this, but I don't want to hold you for that long. I'll give people another couple of seconds to ask any final questions.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just sort of going off of that and thinking about who is considered part of the tech industry, or what types of roles are considered, tech jobs. And I was trying to think about your work at AI Now and connecting this with the earlier part of your talk. And when I think about AI technology, which is like an area of interest of mine, it often feels like a black box technology. And as much as I want to read about it and understand how it works and what different AI projects are happening, it feels kind of like behind a curtain. So I was wondering what the sort of computing citizens of the AI world might look like, or how we might think about contemporary computing citizens for this like history that's sort of in progress.
Yes, so thank you for that question. And I should say, like, please go to AI Now's website, because we have many reports that actually get at answering your question. But just for example, like and these are the unrecognized computing citizens of the AI world, I would say, or the hidden computing citizens. So people like my colleagues, Mary Gray, who wrote a book called Ghost Work, about the fact that all of the work done by what we'd consider mechanical Turks or mechanical Turk work, or a lot of data labeling that is crucial to how these AI technologies are put into place. Labeling images for something like image recognition and image databases. All of this work is done by people who are vital to these AI systems and often underpaid. We're not even talking living wages. We're talking they're paid pennies per task without any sort of health insurance or social safety net. And also people like content moderators who do the work of, truly risky and damaging psychological traumatic work to separate out what people shouldn't be seeing in terms of images and videos online, or whatever is considered unsafe content. There are people doing that work. And so much of AI is a facade because so much data, like I said, it's not neutral. It is created and constructed, and there are people doing the work of labeling and categorizing, classifying, even something that many people take for granted, like, oh, we should categorize gender as a binary. So many scholars would say gender is not a binary, that is a social construct. But there is work that is often done to sort of say gender is this or this, and we're going to label people doing the work of sort of labeling images that way. So I would say, I hope this starts to answer your question, just the fact that so many algorithmic technologies are dependent on people who are not seen. Oh, one more perfect example, Amazon. Amazon is like hugely dependent on human beings for execution of its algorithms in terms of warehouse collection and retrieval and shipping. And Amazon is essentially now a logistics company, but employing humans in ways that are not safe or sustainable because it is a corporation interested in profit. So, yeah.
Wonderful. While you were answering that, we got two more questions. So the first one is from Alessandra, or Ale. And Ale asks, I would love to hear more about what the pushing out of women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color programmers and users looked like. So I think like during the 60s and 70s, were there specific threshold moments?
Oh, this is a great question, and I have literally taught an entire course on it, so I will try to make my answer real fast. And I can share a syllabus of the course that I taught about this if I am reminded. So computer as a noun used to refer, prior to World War II, referred to people who did mathematical calculations and computations. Those were computers. We often forget this now, or choose to forget this, and we often especially choose to forget it because many of those computers were women, and they were women of color, they were Indigenous women who were educated in math, and this was the only type of job that they could get, and it was important work, but it was because it was work done by women, it was not necessarily valued as such, because how we value work as a society often has to do with the identity of the worker, not the work being done. Anyways, as we moved into World War II globally and computers became something that was a machine that was electronic and digital and programmable, women actually did much of the early programming work on those machines. Again, it was sort of, even though it was absolutely work that was invaluable, essential to national security, required a high level of skill and education, it was considered clerical work. And here, actually, I'll point to my colleague, Mar Hicks. Their book, Programmed Equality, does a great job of laying out the case in the UK of how women did this essential, important tech work and were actively, over the course of the 60s and 70s, pushed out of the civil service because computing became recognized as more socially important and economically valuable. And so the work became more prestigious. And through a series of things like the creation, and now I'm jumping back to the US case, the creation of computer science programs and other forms of credentialing, it became a masculine, or seen as a masculine job area. So this is really happening sort of gradually, and there's no one turning point. I would argue there are many turning points, even what I talk about in my book about how BASIC is created at what's at the time an all men's college. So sort of through many processes happening, computing becomes professionalized, masculinized, and goes from being a technology that is primarily seen as feminine to something that is seen as masculine.
Amazing. And I'll put you and Alessandra in contact after the event. And Alessandra is a professor at Concordia, and involved with one of our future events, and we'll be speaking as part of the series at some point. And the last question for tonight is from Anonymous.
Okay.
Did the PLATO users and operators end up developing any moderation tools to deal with harassment? And they want to add that they're not suggesting that technological solutions are enough on their own, but they're curious about any tools they may have made.
Yes. So I stopped my research on PLATO circa 1976. And at that point, I had not seen any rules or guidelines for moderation. What I did see often was conversations almost in the other direction about censorship and fears of censorship, and the idea that, and I mention this because we hear echoes of this today and how free speech is treated, that people should, there was like a lot of advocacy in PLATO in the early 70s that people should be able to say what they want to say, even if it was government funded, because this was a free speech issue, without a recognition that actually sort of espousing free speech is not neutral. It's choosing to value certain types of speech, including hate speech, over recognizing the harms that, quote, free speech can cause to many others.
Fantastic. Well, we're done with the questions from attendees. Okay. And I just want to thank you again, Joy, for doing this event with us. I want to thank everyone in attendance. I again want to thank our captioner, and thank you everyone for participating in the 2020 events. We'll be back again. I think January 6th is our next event, but I'll be posting on our social media website. We also have a listserv you can join, and you can see videos of past events and this event to share with your friends who couldn't make it tonight. So thank you everyone so much. Oh, people just wrote thank you. Oh. And yeah, so thank you everyone, and have a great evening. Goodbye.
Thank you for great questions. Yes.